Hello and welcome to Cybersecurity Awareness Week 2019. We often refer to it as CSAW for short. CSAW was first launched by Bluegrass in 2017 and our aim was to educate businesses so that particularly SMEs could stay safe from the cyber threat. Today we're here to talk about 5 security essentials businesses should be thinking about for cyber threat protection. But firstly, let me make some introductions. I'm David Thomas, the Managing Director of Bluegrass Group. Bluegrass provide IT managed services, cybersecurity solutions and professional services to businesses around the Southwest and the Midlands. I'd now like to introduce Nick Ross from Sophos. Hi Nick, can you tell us a bit about yourself, what you do and Sophos?
Yeah, of course. So my name is Nick. I'm a channel sales engineer with Sophos. And if you haven't dealt with Sophos before, we're a cybersecurity company essentially founded here in the UK. We're very proud to have some very simple and easy to use and effective solutions to help keep customers and their data safe within the cybersecurity world.
Thanks, Nick. So at Bluegrass, we're seeing daily stories of cyber attacks. And for an SME, that can often be very daunting. But in reality, the steps are straightforward, even though the backdrop is that the business really doesn't know what to do. So Nick, you're here today to take us through what you would consider to be 5 security essentials that can really help businesses.
Absolutely.
Your first tip is to deploy next generation endpoint protection. That sounds flashy. What is that, Nick?
That's a good question. So obviously the cyber threat is constantly evolving and there's constantly new malicious code and problems that we're seeing on a day-to-day basis out there. Next generation endpoint is essentially an evolution of endpoint security. So typical antivirus and traditional anti-malware products that you might well have seen. Next generation endpoint products essentially are not only looking out for those traditional type attacks, which have been seen over the last 10, 20 years or so, but also looking at threats that are much more sophisticated. For example, there's a piece of malware out there at the moment called Imitet, which is highly sophisticated in the way it works. Cyber criminals are constantly evolving and changing their malicious code that they're using to keep us on our toes. So we need to be making sure that we're using technology that's aware of techniques and vulnerabilities that this code makes use of.
Okay. And can you just explain what the new virus is doing or malware is doing at a high level?
Absolutely. Well, a lot of the people on the webinar today will probably be aware of the term ransomware.
Yeah.
Ransomware is a thing that we're constantly having to deal with, unfortunately. It's not going away anytime soon. And the problem we have is that a lot of the cyber criminals are actually using tools that they're finding on the dark web. They're able to buy using stolen credit cards or bitcoins that allow them to create very unique and crafted malware that is very different to another attack that was seen perhaps the previous week before. And so traditional endpoint security that is using what we refer to as signatures or definitions to identify bad stuff, unfortunately, 80+% of the bad stuff that we see out there has never been seen before. And therefore, we're having to really change gear in terms of being able to detect that never been seen before malware.
And you mentioned the dark web. Bluegrass, we've investigated the dark web just to see the extent to which it can go. It's quite a scary place, isn't it? Because you can get anything you want on there, and anybody can buy ransomware nowadays. Even just a guy in the bedroom can do whatever he wants. Yeah,
that's right. I mean, essentially, the cyber criminals have de-skilled their trade in many senses, because you don't have to be an expert at these things in order to get your hands on them. Unfortunately, there are a lot of really horrible things available on the dark web. You know, malware and malicious technology is just one of those things. And essentially, an ecosystem has been created for themselves whereby they can share and exchange knowledge and information, again, without you having to have lots of experience in this space.
So it's quite frightening, and it means that the threat's real, and anybody can do it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you know, the interesting for us as a cybersecurity company is that it has really kept us on our toes. It's kind of revitalized what was a very boring industry, I think. Fair to say beforehand. You know, antivirus was quite plain and simple, and really it came down to what color product you wanted to use. These days, there's a lot more to consider as a buyer and as a customer wanting to keep your organization safe. There's a lot more questions you need to be asking of what a vendor is able to do for you and how their product will keep you safe.
So in summary on this one, it is about not just sticking with, say, an antivirus product that you may well have had for 10 or 15 years. It's really looking at the marketplace now and choosing something which is capable of dealing with ever-changing threats.
Yeah, absolutely agreed. And the guys at Bluegrass will be absolutely able to help and guide customers through that decision-making process. But I think you're right. I think a lot more questions need to be asked in terms of whether a product is fit for purpose and will help keep customers and their data safe.
Okay, thank you. So let's move on to the second one, which you've defined as protect at the network layer. Now that sounds technical, and it probably is, but can you explain that for us?
Essentially, in a nutshell, it doesn't need to be overly complicated, but the point being, we've just talked about endpoint security and how so much of the malicious activity that we see in organisation systems these days comes down to the end user having bought that malicious code into the organisation, whether it be on an email or whether them browsing an infected website, etc. By protecting at the network layer, you're kind of taking the kind of opportunity away from the end user to allow this bad stuff in, because essentially you're scanning before the end user is even allowed to connect to the internet, or before a user is allowed to connect in from the outside to your network.
Okay.
So using technologies like next generation firewalls, for example, that are absolutely up to date and aware of what current threats look like.
So it's a second layer of protection, isn't it? Because your first layer in this instance is what's on an endpoint, so for example a PC, and then we're layering it again on the network to make it more complicated and difficult for the criminal to get through.
Yes, agreed, absolutely. The thing to consider with network security is that it is the first and last line of defense. It's stopping the bad stuff coming in before it even gets to the end user.
Yeah.
And also it's potentially stopping the bad stuff getting out if, for example, a computer has been compromised. It also serves other purposes as well. So, for example, it might be protecting corporate data if GDPR is of a concern to an organisation.
Yeah.
What about leaking data out of the organisation? Then obviously a next-gen firewall is going to really help with that. And the last point to make on this as well is that a lot of your customers will either be already consuming services in the public cloud, whether it be putting stuff into Azure or AWS, for example, or they'll be looking to do something similar, perhaps as part of an Office 365 migration project, say, for example. And so really we've got this vanishing perimeter whereby if you're using services or consuming services that are in the cloud, actually your network no longer is just what's inside the four walls of your organization. It's actually your data that's also hosted in the cloud.
Yeah.
Users might be accessing that data directly and not even touching your systems on premise anymore.
Okay.
So keeping that data safe is apparent.
So we're only 2 tips in so far, but it's very recognizable that whilst these are tips, these are actually quite important, aren't they? Because criminals will try and find every way they can to get into an organization.
Yep.
And obviously your front door, your network, is the one they're going to try.
Yes.
And then after that, they'll attack the PC, etc. So tips, but they're actually essential tips.
Yeah, and I think to that point, I think it's important to understand why these cyber criminals get involved in this type of activity in the first place. The payoff to them, or the potential payoff to them, is massive. Data has a value, and so if they can get their mitts on important data, it doesn't even need to necessarily be intellectual property.
No.
It could be just users' data that they can then sell to the highest bidder online. They have an inclination to come after you, and they'll also do a lot of research and an initial understanding of the organisation that they want to target before they actually try and make that attack. It's not a spray and pray type of approach that they're taking anymore.
No, and Nick mentioned about selling the data. What they do is they take your data and they put it on the dark web, and they sell it for maybe £1. It doesn't cost very much for criminals to buy, but when they buy en masse, they can do a lot of damage. Okay, so number 3 is to make the most of what you've got.
Absolutely.
I'm intrigued by this one, Nick.
Well, I think the thing to bear in mind, obviously, it'd be very easy for me from a cybersecurity vendor to just come and say you need to buy lots of security products to help keep you safe. And absolutely, obviously, it'd be silly of me not to suggest that that's a good idea, with obviously the caveat that they should be buying the right purchases and making the right purchases with the advice of somebody like yourselves. However, actually, a lot of customers out there already have invested a lot of money in cybersecurity products. And those products may well be fit for purpose. One of the challenges that we do see, however, is unfortunately a lot of customers buy stuff and then they don't go on to deploy it or use it. And so I would always recommend, speaking to trusted partners such as yourselves at Bluegrass to understand, okay, what have I got as an organization, and am I making best use of what I've got? it may well be, for example, that there are small tweaks and changes, or maybe small additional purchases that can be made to complement that existing technology that organizations have.
Yeah, and that's something we have seen, whereby businesses have been or have bought certain products, but they're not using them effectively or even at all, really. And it's unlocking the potential for safety, extra security by making the most of what you've got.
Yeah, I agree. I think that IT audit sort of approach would be very important because, as we've already said, the threat landscape is constantly evolving, stuff's changing all the time. And so what was fit for purpose for keeping your organization safe, 2 or 3 years ago, may well no longer be the case. So it's always worth constantly analysing that and making sure that we're keeping organisations and their data safe.
Yeah, because one way to look at it is that we are, as businesses, we're building walls, and we're trying to make our walls as high as possible. But unfortunately, the criminals are making longer ladders. So as fast as we build the wall, the criminals are going even higher and they're trying to get over the top. So it's one of those things that Nick's right, that you do have to make the most of what you've got and use it to the best of for your business. So next up actually is a really critical one, and that's training end users.
Yeah.
So first of all, what do you mean by training?
Well, it's quite a broad subject, to be honest. Obviously, in the interest of time, trying to summarise this as much as I can. So essentially the point is, as I made earlier on, is that the end users are a great risk to an organisation. They're the ones who are consuming services, going on the internet, receiving emails. These are the points of attack that a lot of cyber criminals are making use of. And so it's really important that we train our end users, what we often refer to as the human firewall, to help keep an organisation safe. That could come down to many things, really. It might be as part of an onboarding program for new members of staff. This is how we as an organisation take compliance and things like GDPR seriously. This is how we expect you to behave within the organisation when you use the internet, not misusing systems, plugging in USB sticks if that's something that you as an organisation have decided you don't want to do. And also, as well as initial training for new starters, it's about ongoing training because people forget. We're all human beings at the end of the day, and so there's a risk that this stuff gets forgotten over a period of time. So constantly assessing that, maybe doing an annual or biannual training session or a refresh and reminder. Sophos have seen some significant traction in the last 18 months with a product that we have called Phish Threat. So our Phish Threat platform is essentially a phishing awareness training product that essentially allows customers to phish like the bad guys. So they can use that product to send out phishing simulation emails to their end users to essentially get an understanding for how susceptible their organization is to getting phished in real life. It's quite neat. The system will actually allow you to create from a whole bunch of built-in templates a fairly bona fide looking phishing email. You can then send that out to your staff and then see the results come in as to who was foolish enough to click on those links or open up those file attachments in that phishing email. What's really neat about it is that we will then provide that training bit that we're making a point of here, which is some flash training courses that will actually guide the users through, okay, you slipped up this time, you did something you shouldn't have done really, but here's some instructions or some guidance on how to better avoid an actual real phishing email.
Yeah, and actually that's something that we've seen a lot of, not just this year, but the back end of last year, where users are receiving not the training phishing emails, but phishing emails from criminals. They look legitimate, they click the link, they enter details, or their credentials, and then the criminal has them. But often the user doesn't know that that's happened because it all looks so legitimate. So this kind of training, it's not expensive, but it's one of those things that really helps your business. And if you take it from the approach of this not only helps when you're talking to staff, actually, this doesn't just help the business, this will help you in your personal life as well.
Oh, agreed. Absolutely. I think there's some stats from our labs. So Sophos have their own labs team. We're constantly analysing threats and new malicious activity that we see. And there's some stats coming from that team that suggest that 70 to 80% of ransomware threats that we've seen in the wild actually initially at some point during the delivery stages started with a phishing email. So straight away, if we can mitigate and reduce a lot of that kind of opportunity for the cyber criminals, reduce the susceptibility of end users clicking on the silly stuff, then we're going to take away a big revenue opportunity for those cyber criminals and reduce that problem. The only other point I will make on the training as well is phishing starts with phishing. If we can reduce that, then great. But there's other best practices as well that we really need to educate end users on. For example, you mentioned there, Dave, about passwords, and if somebody enters their credentials into a website, then that's potentially game over. And the biggest reason that is potentially game over for that end user, unfortunately, is that they probably consume a lot of services on the internet. They're probably using Amazon and eBay and various other buying sites to buy things online, do their Christmas shopping, etc. But then it might also extend to things like internet banking and various other tools as well. Some things that people absolutely don't want to be without. And unfortunately, when it comes to passwords, a lot of people still use the same credentials, same details for all these services. So straight away, I as a cyber criminal, if I manage to get my hands on somebody's username and password for service A, it doesn't take a genius to think I might try and use that password and username for service B as well. So you're giving out the keys to the castle essentially by not using these kind of simple things like having a different username and password for each of the services you consume.
Simple but important.
Yeah.
And your last tip is coordinate your technology. What do you mean by this one?
Yeah, so I guess it's a bit of a subtle nod to the strategy that Sophos is seeing at the moment. So one of the things that we are very proud of at Sophos is that we have a really broad portfolio of products from Sophos that can help customers keep customers safe, I beg your pardon, whether that be at the network layer, end user protection, right the way through to keeping their data in the cloud safe and so on. What we're seeing a lot of interest now from the industry is actually bringing those really good technologies in that run independently to one another together as part of a system. So it may well be that some of the buyers and users of IT security out there have previously been used to the concept of having lots of different products from lots of different vendors to keep them safe. That unfortunately just doesn't work.
No.
Unless you have an army of people working in your IT team to help manage and coordinate that technology for you, the benefit really of having a synchronized security platform, which is from less vendors and much more consolidated, is going to keep you a lot more up to date and aware of what's going on within your organization.
Yeah, thanks. And actually, before we move off on this, I want to talk about some of the Sophos products. And I guess at this point, I should say that these products are available from all different kinds of providers as well. But from your perspective, Nick, what would you say, product-wise, for yourselves, are really key that businesses as a minimum should have from your product set, and equally they can get that from other providers? Yeah,
sure. So the two that I would lead with typically at the moment are our Intercept X platform, which is a next generation endpoint product, as I mentioned earlier, and coordinating that with our XG firewall, our next generation firewall product that will help keep customers' data and their end users safe at the perimeter of their organization. As I said earlier on, be that on-premise in a traditional sense of a network or in the cloud as well.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Nick. Now, hopefully you've heard from Nick's suggestions that it doesn't take a huge amount of time or money to safeguard your business, and that really it's essential that we all understand the threat is real for SMEs. We, since GDPR, have seen so many or heard of so many attacks on SMEs. They're not going away. But implementing these straightforward steps that Nick has outlined for us will help protect your business. If you have any questions or need any advice, or our details, in fact, they're going to be shown at the end of the webinar. I'd like to say thank you to Nick for attending, and thank you for watching. Stay safe.